I'm writing.
So let's talk about now we're pushing the historical aspect aside, but let's talk about the polemical aspect. The Torah is obviously doing something, which you alluded to before. It's trying to expose the false deities of the ancient Egyptian world, right? And
yes.
it does so in a very direct and explicit manner. So can you explain how the Torah is doing that?
Yeah, I think I can give a few good examples. The first one I want to bring is from the Nile itself, and I think that's key. So it's worthwhile. Let's say two birds with one stone. I'll talk about the Pharaoh as well, because the Pharaoh is very intertwined with Egyptian mythology, and it's important to understand the Nile, to understand Pharaoh, to understand the mythology. So let's tie that all together. For those listening and not seeing, we're looking at an image on Google Earth of the land of Egypt. And the land of Egypt is actually the narrowest country in the world. And the reason I'm saying the narrowest is because in ancient times, before the advent of electricity and infrastructure, life was limited to the banks of the Nile River. You'd dig canals, you'd extend the river as much as you could, but that was pretty much it. So at its narrowest, it was 1 kilometer wide. That's less than a mile, right? So Egypt was this long strip of land that was just completely dependent on the Nile flow. And that's the entire area of the Nile is called the Nile Valley. When it reaches the north, and it's actually on a slope downward, so the Egyptians called the southern part Upper Egypt, actually, and as it made its way down into the Mediterranean Sea and sort of spread out into a triangular shape with a delta shape, the letter delta. In Greek, it's what the Greeks called it, the Nile Delta. That is called Lower Egypt. So Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt is the opposite of up and down for us who are familiar with North and South. So the first Pharaoh of Egypt actually unified Upper and Lower Egypt and conquered them and unified them into one kingdom. And so the first Pharaoh, in effect, is the unifier of both lands. Why is that important? Because the life source of Egypt is the Nile. And the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. It was everything for them. And the Pharaoh controlled it and brought it together. So the Pharaoh was something divine in that sense, where he's intertwined with the fact that the Nile is life-giving, the life-giving force. Now, Egypt was ruled ever since then by pharaohs, and the name Pharaoh eventually came into place. They weren't called Pharaoh at first; he was just the king of Egypt. But the Pharaoh is something divine. Now, how does that connect to mythology? This is a very interesting story. There's many variations of Egyptian mythology, but generally speaking, there is the story of the sun god Ra, who had 5 children. And the famous ones of them are Isis, Osiris, and Set. Right? There's also Nephthys, etc. But the point is, those 3 are important for our story. So Isis and Osiris marry each other and are supposed to be the heirs to the throne. And Seth is, of course, very jealous of that. He kills Osiris, rips him up to pieces and spreads him across the ocean, and so he can't be put back together. Isis is able to put him back together and raise him from the dead. So Isis is basically the resurrected king. He's the king of the world of the dead. And eventually, long story short, their son Horus is able to avenge his father's death, and he fights his uncle Seth and banishes him from the throne. He was a usurper for a while, and he ends up being the ruler of the world of the living and the world of the dead. How is that connected? Because we have the upper world and the lower world, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, the world of the living, the world of the dead, being unified by this mythological character called Ho, or Horus, as the Greek called him. He's a falcon. He's a sky god, and he unifies Egypt. So for the ancient Egyptians, Pharaoh was an incarnation of Horus, which is why the early name for Pharaoh, before he was called Pharaoh, was actually Horus. Just like we say Pharaoh Ramses, it was Horus Narmer. Horus was the epitaph, was what they called kings. So he's the unifier. So this deep mythological connection all intertwined with the life-giving force of the Nile. So we have that background. Now when we zoom in and we want to talk about trying to make a message that will speak to the Pharaoh and make the people understand, you have to attack the Nile. And so the first plagues deal directly with the Nile, right? We have Dam and Sfardea. We have the plague of blood, which directly attacks the life force of the Nile. And we have the frogs, right? Which it's interesting that the Abravanel thought that frogs would actually be crocodiles, which are pesky little creatures in Egypt, So he knew something about Egypt, which is really fun. At the time of the Abravanel, nobody knew how to read hieroglyphics. So we couldn't have learned what we know now about ancient Egypt. But they also had frogs. Yeah, I'm saying the point is that he knew about crocodiles. All you have to do is know something about Egypt to know that. So it's kind of cool. So you have Dam Tzfardea. And then you gradually move into the land, small animals, big animals. Then it's not only animals, it's disease. That's like you're getting into genetics, right? Being able to tell the difference between an animal that belongs to Hebrews and that doesn't belong to Hebrews. That's distinction, right? And then you go into the skies. You're talking about day and night. You're talking about hail, fire, and then you finally get to the power of life itself, right? And at that point, like we have, even before that point, but at that point, Pharaoh was willing to let us go, and it's like, please leave, right? But leading up to that, we have several points where Pharaoh is like struggling, and then his own servants are telling him, listen, it's all over, just give it up, like come on, like let it go. And he's like, no, we ain't giving up now. It's like, and like Egypt is done, just let them out. So we see that he's struggling with this, and he realizes that he's already been exposed basically as a rebel without a cause, kind of. But this is gradual. He takes one step forward, two steps back. It takes a while. You can't just, if to borrow a metaphor from Life of Pi, from the book, not from the movie, he sort of like sprinkles in wisdom from the animal kingdom. And he says, people think that taking animals out of the zoo is going to make them free. It's like, imagine coming to a person, kicking them out of their house and saying, you are free now of your dependency on your home and your belongings. You should be happy. And like, really? Like people want their connection to what makes them comfortable, right? And makes them feel in belonging and control. So you can't just make people free by taking them out of Egypt, right? We ourselves have to go through a process of understanding our value and seeing the Egyptians going, who are we to enslave these people? They deserve to go. Let's give them jewelry. Let's give them stuff. Let's treat them well. Like it's a process, and a lot of that's achieved. So that was a general view. I can give a few details, which I think would be very fun.
Before that, actually, the one that occurred to me only a few years ago was that blotting out the sun, which is Ra. That was a big one, like that we overlook that part. So anyway, go on, continue.
Yeah, so let me look at I'm going to jump for a moment to the British Museum, which is a lot of fun. The British Museum has the Rosetta Stone. We all know about that, but that's not directly related to Pesach, only in a tangential way, because the way we learned how to translate hieroglyphics was by identifying the hieroglyphic marker for the name of a king. So, that's about it. It's from the Hellenistic period. But here we are looking at the British Museum, and I want to jump right in, just make sure not to hit a door. We're looking at what's called a false door, which is what you'd see when you walk into a tomb. But I want to show us a few things, and then I'm going to talk about specifically something that's going on with the 10 Makot, okay? So you'll notice there's a king right in front of us. There's a pharaoh who has a very funny kind of conical hat, looks like a Smurf, right? Yeah. That's the crown of Upper Egypt. Narmer, the legendary unifier of both lands, is from Upper Egypt, and we know that because he has a crown, the upper crown, the white crown. The typical crown we're used to looking at, which many pharaohs have, is the crown of Lower Egypt. And we're looking here at the statue. There's a much larger statue. I'm going to get in front of it. I think it's worthwhile. This is Amenhotep III, who, according to Meitlis, as I mentioned, is the pharaoh of the Exodus. He's wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's a combo, which is really neat, right? So it shows you he's the unifier of both lands, and right next to him is a statue of a pharaoh of Lower Egypt. And there's a huge arm here. Now, I'm going to get a better view so those who are watching can see it. But this is from a massive statue that shows you an outstretched arm of the Pharaoh. Yeah. When we talk about biyad chazaka v'zroa netuya, with a strong fist and an outstretched arm, and then you see the strong fist and outstretched arms of the Pharaoh, the statues of the Pharaoh throughout the country, you realize that this is using the language of Egypt to respond to Egypt in the language that makes sense. Like, it's like, and we'll see that in other examples as well. So I thought that's something worthwhile mentioning. We're making our way towards a very particular Egyptian deity, which ties into our question. I'm just pointing out things along the way. For example, the Rosetta Stone right here, world famous. And we have Ramses the Great, wearing also a double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's slightly fragmented, so it's hard to see, but that's what you're looking at. So here's Ramses, and behind him, let's walk through a wall. Here we go.
What are those like chin straps they always have on?
They strap on a beard. The beards were a sign of divinity, like the gods had these beards, but people in Egypt were generally bald, mostly because of lice, also because of the heat. So they would wear a ceremonial hat or not a toupee. What do you call it? A head covering, a sheitel. What's the word I'm looking for?
A toupee or something? Or?
Toupee. So they would wear fake hair. I mean, hair, but they would wear how do you say a pe'ah?
A wig.
Thank you, a wig. They would wear wigs. We've actually found these wigs. But what I want to show you here is one of many rams that are in the temple in Karnak, which is the temple of Amun-Ra, the complex of Amun-Ra in Karnak, which has the ram god. So how does the ram fit into the story? Remember?
The doorposts.
The doorposts, right? We take the blood from the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, the Paschal lamb, we put it on the doorpost. But the concern that we have about one of the times when Moshe is trying to bargain with Pharaoh, let us leave, and he says, I mean, can you imagine the Egyptians not stoning us to death if we would be sacrificing their God, right? But we don't know, like, it's easy to say, yeah, the Egyptians worshipped animals, right? But then you see it. And the ram god actually represents Amun-Ra. So the most powerful god in Egypt, Amun-Ra. Amun is like the hidden name, and then there's Ra. So they have different combinations. So Amun-Ra, and here he is protecting the Pharaoh. And this is from the complex of Amun-Ra in one of the greatest temples in ancient Egypt, which was dedicated to Amun-Ra, who is represented by the ram.
Wow.
So this is a big one.
It is a big one. It's a big one because, we look at that story as almost like it's after the plagues. So it's not as significant in our minds. But the way you're explaining it is that this is the highest God. So actually, it's a culmination of, like, that's the apex when that happens. Like, they're killing the greatest God of Egypt and putting on their doorposts. Obviously, God knows which house to pass over, but it's a very significant event.
Right.
It changes us.